The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honour.
I received the minutes of our meeting held on Monday, 25th March, and Friday, May the 3rd, for confirmation. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of the meetings held on Monday, the 25th of March, and Friday, May 3rd, 2024.
The question is that the minutes of our meetings on Monday, 25th March, and Friday, 3rd May be confirmed. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Meetings the ayes have it. Those minutes are confirmed. I have excuses of absence from Her Excellency, Her Honor, Senator Thompson, Deputy President, and the Most Honorable Senator Jerome Walcott, and indication of late arrival from the Honorable Chad Blackman. Oh, sorry, and also apologies for absence from Senator Ryan Walters. By way of further announcements, let me take the opportunity to welcome some visitors to the Senate, members of teaching staff of the Common Layer School. In no particular order, just calling the names as given. I don't know if there's any rank or order around there. Maybe I should call Terry Haynes first because I've seen him, none of them have seen him around for many years, university and other places. But so there's Terry Haynes, Shamari Haynes, Amal Seeley, Lisa Cummings, if you have a twin, yeah, Lisa. Yeah. All right. Dominique Greenidge, John Bannister, Sophia Farley, Victoria Graves. Which one is Sophia Farley? Oh, hello. Well, I would imagine so, but I don't know. We'll investigate that further. Welcome. The group is on a visit to the Honorable Senate today. We welcome you, and we hope that your commentarians that are on various sides of the chamber will cause you to lift your head higher and not otherwise. Thank you very much.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents today. They are as follows: the annual report and audited financial statements of the Student Revolving Loan Fund for the year ended March 31st, 2023. The report of the Barbados General Election 2022. The deed of guarantee between the government of Barbados acting through the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment as guarantor and the Africa Export-Import Bank as the lender relating to obligations under a USD $25 million term loan facility agreement between the Kensington Oval Management Inc. and the Africa Export-Import Bank. Fourth, the 2023 annual report and financial statements of the Central Bank of Barbados.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions related to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is, a Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. The ayes have it, and the Standing Order is therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills, first readings.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Child Protection Bill 2024 and second, order number 5 on the order paper, the first reading of the Child Justice Bill of 2024.
The question is that the Child Protection Bill 2024 and the Child Justice Bill 2024 be read a first time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The things the ayes have, those bills are accordingly read a first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 4, sir. Order number 4, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, but is signed to Senator the Honorable the Honorable Monroe Knight. She will move in the second reading of the Child Protection Bill 2024.
Senator the Honourable Dr. Chantal Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, there's something about my name this morning. I think it's perhaps all of the double names that we've had from our guests. But Mr. President, I want to thank you so very much for recognizing me as I stand to lead this debate. In fact, Mr. President, I would suggest that it is a great privilege to do so. There are some moments when I have cause to reflect on the important role that we are all called to play in this place, and the way that we have that big responsibility for helping to apply the governance of this country. And those moments, Mr. President, when I'm caused to reflect on that important role, that important responsibility, is shaped by the fact that there are pieces of legislation that have such a far-reaching impact on the social fabric of this country that they stand out amongst all of the other work that we do in this honourable chamber. So, Mr. President, while all pieces of legislation that come before us in this chamber and we deliberate on are important, I would suggest, however, and perhaps that might just be me personally, that there are certain pieces of legislation that are touchstone points for us within the society. And I would suggest that this bill that we are deliberating, the Child Protection Bill this morning, Mr. President, is one of those pieces. I am often one to say, Mr. President, that I know that we have to focus on the issue of growth as a society. Growth is important. Growth is how a country will be able to have the resources that it needs in order to carry out many of the programs that it wants to see for itself. But I also believe fundamentally that that growth is only meaningful, and I use that word deliberately, if it is undergirded by key tenets of fairness, of justice, of an awareness that that growth must function for those within our society that are vulnerable, that are poor, Mr. President, that are dependent, that don't necessarily have the resources by themselves or are in situations which suggests that they are not able to fully take care of themselves. And that a society that only focuses on growth without these tenets is a society, Mr. President, that will not, I want to suggest, function as it should and provide for, I would say, the moral and ethical responsibility that states should have for its citizens. And Mr. President, we would think that these are things that are obvious, that all states see this as important, that it is part of the, I would say, sine qua non of being a government, that we understand fully that we have to take care of our citizens. But I want to suggest and to remind that that is perhaps not the case. All societies are grounded upon philosophical tenets that determine the trajectory and the way that citizens are treated. And if we go back to philosophy, Mr. President, and those old philosophers who were part of delineating how societies should function, and their theories then galvanizing how governments and how other institutions work, we would understand that that is not always the case. Not always the case that governments understand their responsibility to take care of the poor, the vulnerable, to take care of those who are not able to do so for themselves. In fact, Mr. President, there was a philosopher, David Hume. And David Hume's treatise on human nature suggested, in fact, that those within society who were poor and who were weak, use the word weak, Mr. President, that while the government should, in its humanness, seek to help or assist, that because those members of society were seen as weak, were seen as incapable of being treated as equals, he actually used those words, that those people who were weak, those people who had less power in society, should not be treated as equals. That while the state should try to be compassionate to them, that they really and truly should not have a say, should not have ownership, should not have voice, should not have agency within society. And while some would suggest that, again, that is perhaps historical philosophy, if we understand that our liberal economic frame that we use and that most of the world applies focuses on autonomy, self-autonomy, self-entrepreneurship, individual rights, repudiation of the state. The state should not enter into certain spheres, that we all have our private domain that the state should not enter into. And that there is, within that frame of liberalism, the notion as well that it is the strong, those that are strong and those that are well able and well capable, that the society as well should galvanize behind and hope that we have some level of trickle down to those that are less able within our society. So I make that point, Mr. President, to say that we should not see it as obvious that a state will seek to protect the most vulnerable and those that are dependent within our society. That it has to be done by deliberate design. A state must have a particular ethos about its development and the development of its people in order to ensure the level of care that is needed, the level of care that is required. In this child protection bill, Mr. President, I want to suggest that this is a signal that we are sending, and I say we, Mr. President, not government, but we as a society are sending to everyone, all of us within this society, and to others as well looking on, about who we are as a country, as a state, about what we prioritize, about who is important within our society. That we are sending a signal that as a country, the protection of our children, the protection of those that are most vulnerable and often most powerless within our society is critical. It's critical, Mr. President. And of course, Mr. President, we would have had a suite of legislation attempting to do so. But the importance of this bill that we are considering this morning in this honorable chamber is that it seeks to ensure that we have the best fit, most comprehensive piece of legislation in order to provide the utmost protection for that social group. And I believe, Mr. President, that we can all agree that when we talk about how a government and how a society should send signals of the importance of groups within its makeup, the elderly, the disabled, and again, children are paramount. Mr. President, I am confident, as I said, that I can say we when I speak to this piece of legislation before us. Because this piece of legislation has gone through a very thorough process of public ventilation. Again, Mr. President, by design. Mr. President, by design. So we have a piece of legislation that we as a society can take ownership of, Mr. President. We had a process in which this piece of legislation was referred to the Joint Select Standing Committee for Social Sector and the Environment in May of 2023. In May of 2023, Mr. President. Ensuring a period of full public ventilation. And of course, Mr. President, we are aware that even outside of that process, that the public was engaging the matter very frontally and sending signals as well. And I really want to reiterate again, because there are those that would suggest that, yes, the pieces of legislation and pieces, I mean, Mr. President, this child protection bill and also the child justice bill, which should be seen as a companion to going together as they are creating a nexus, were sent to the Joint Select Committee after there were issues raised within the public domain. And I would only say, Mr. President, but that is exactly the nature of a responsive government. A responsive government is one that listens to its people, that reflects, that understands when there is sufficient disquiet within the society, that it needs to provide space for the public to be able to make organized input into refining the legislation and making sure, Mr. President, that their voices are heard and that we can satisfy all of ourselves, that again, we can have ownership. And that Joint Select Committee process, Mr. President, as I said, began, and that Joint Select Committee, and I want, Mr. President, with your indulgence, to identify the members of that committee, because I believe that it is important that we understand again that this was not a committee in which government sat and was listening to itself. The members of that Joint Select Committee, which were appointed, Mr. President, was Ms. Toni Moore, who was chair, Senator John King, Deputy Chair, MP Cynthia Ford, MP Trevor Prescott, MP the Honorable Corey Lane, Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers, and Senator Dr. the Honorable Charleston Brathwaite, Mr. President. Those were the members of the Standing Select Committee charged with responsibility to hear and to compile all of the inputs from citizens, Mr. President. That committee held 7 meetings over the period of July 27th to February 20th, 2024. July 27th, 2023 to February 20th, 2024. A period, Mr. President, when it received a number of submissions. It invited, Mr. President, organizations, approximately 27 stakeholder groups, to make written submissions to it, again, so that it can ensure that it had as wide as possible of an input. Mr. President, I want to indicate that the report of the Joint Select Committee is available online. You can get the minutes, Mr. President, of those proceedings, Mr. President. So you have a summary report. You can identify all of the written submissions that were received in full, Mr. President, if you want to, Mr. President. So that I am going through this so that we can satisfy ourselves again, that we have a piece of legislation that provided for the widest possible input, included input from the Democratic Labour Party, Mr. President. Mr. President, written submissions were invited from churches across Barbados, including the Anglican Diocese of Barbados. We had, Mr. President, the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners being invited, professional social workers, the Bar Association, Christian Council, Council for the Disabled, Mr. President, the Juvenile Liaison Scheme, Parados, Mr. President, the Pentecostal Association of the West Indies, Mr. President. The committee received written submissions from 13 stakeholders. And again, Mr. President, those written submissions can be viewed online. If you were like me, again, because I am a mother, Mr. President, because I too have come into contact with children, Mr. President, I know who go to sleep and go to bed hungry, Mr. President, because I too, Mr. President, am concerned when I see children on the streets at all hours of the night. I am concerned, and Honorable Senator says, I am concerned when I see children at certain events and wonder about the parental oversight, Mr. President. So that even though I was not part of the committee, and even though I would have the opportunity to be here, I took, Mr. President, I paid attention, Mr. President, to the discussions, because just as a member of this society and understanding the importance of the area and the importance of the discussion, Mr. President, I paid attention. And I know that a number of Barbadians paid attention to the discussion, paid attention to the oral submissions. There were times, Mr. President, when a written submission was made and the committee would invite, again, those persons or that person that would have made that written submission to come to meet before them so that they can understand fully the concerns, Mr. President. So that even outside of the written submissions, the committee also as well heard oral presentations made to it on this matter, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I want to thank all of those right-thinking Barbadians that would have participated, those right-thinking Barbadians that would have followed the discussion, those right-thinking Barbadians that would have looked critically at the draft legislation that would have been available on the Parliament website, that would have been able to be discerning as they heard the discourse. And I say deliberately right-thinking Barbadians, Mr. President, because unfortunately, Mr. President, and I say disappointingly, Mr. President, we found that there was a deliberate, in my opinion, Mr. President, a deliberate attempt by some in this society to introduce elements into the discourse that were blatantly untrue in order to stir up public angst and fear, Mr. President. In order to introduce elements that would distract from the fundamental nature of this piece of legislation. Those persons, Mr. President, under the guise of a political association, even though it was revealed later on that that was not necessarily the case, Mr. President, sought to carry Barbadians down a path that was completely completely, Mr. President, away from what this piece of legislation was attempting to do, to obscure the fact that as a government, that as a people, the important task at hand was to ensure that we had the most comprehensive and fit for purpose legislation that we can have for the protection of our children, Mr. President. Mr. President, they said all sorts of things. One point I heard that we were going to try to introduce this legislation and then inject the children with something or the other, and do tests on the children, Mr. President. I got children. I don't know, I think there are other people in this chamber that have children, Mr. President. So I would like to understand what benefit it would have been for us as a government to be introducing legislation to do harm, Mr. President, to ourselves. I don't know, Mr. President. They said, Mr. President, that this piece of legislation was primarily about sexual orientation, Mr. President, and how the government was going to attempt to slip in that children would be able to choose what it was their gender orientation, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have searched this piece of legislation, and nowhere in this piece of legislation, Mr. President, despite the marches, despite the outrage and outcry, responsible and right-thinking Barbadians, Mr. President, responsible and right-thinking Barbadians, Mr. President, understand, can see and have proof that this legislation is far, far from that. That this legislation had no contemplation, Mr. President, of those issues. That this legislation, Mr. President, was focused on ensuring that we had a piece of legislation that would address the critical deficits of all of the existing hodgepodge of legislation that existed previously. That the legislation was about ensuring that we would provide protection for those children that needed to be protected, Mr. President, that need to be protected. Those that are most vulnerable, those that are in situations, Mr. President, where they are being exploited. This is what this piece of legislation focuses on. So, Mr. President, I want to therefore thank and to acknowledge the hard work of Minister Kurt Humphrey and his team of hardworking employees in the Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs, especially those of the Child Care Board, who would have had to withstand those attacks, Mr. President, who would have had to be at the forefront of working through what they would have been seeing within the public domain as falsehood, but still focusing on task at hand, still staying the course, still staying on guard to ensure that they were able to deliver this piece of legislation. And it is a testimony, Mr. President, to that focus that we are here at this point with this piece of legislation that would ensure the protection of our children. Mr. President, the Honorable Minister Kurt Humphrey would have stated in the other place that this legislation is not a fly in the pan legislation, Mr. President. The government had, since 2021, made a decision that it wanted a more comprehensive piece of legislation for child protection. And that journey, Mr. President, did not even start necessarily with this administration. It didn't start with this administration, and we acknowledge that fully, that the protection of our children has been an issue that all administrations have been toiling with, that all administrations have been concerned with, have been making concerted efforts to be able to deliver and to address. This administration has brought it to fruition, Mr. President. But we acknowledge, Mr. President, that this is something that has been at the forefront of government's attention, Mr. President, regardless of administration. And I say that with confidence because I can identify a number of policies, a number of interventions that were done over a period of time, Mr. President, that identify the work of various administrations. Mr. President, I want to identify the white paper on laws related to children, women, and their families in Barbados, analysis, harmonization of the case of reform that was done in 2015. I want to identify the submission of the Cabinet Committee on Social Policy of the policy paper review of the white paper on laws related to children, women, and their families in Barbados that was done in 2017, Mr. President. The mandatory reporting protocol on child abuse, Mr. President, that was done in 2017 as well, Mr. President. And the updated situational assessment of child protection in Barbados that was done in 2020, the assessment of other areas required of law reforms to ensure policy coherence on children's issues that was done in 2021. So all of these pieces, Mr. President, done over a period of time, have been brought to bear in this legislation. So this is not a piece of legislation that we have been hot and heavy on, Mr. President. This is a piece of legislation that has been the result of careful study and analysis that we have brought to bear, expert opinion, Mr. President, people's opinion, stakeholders' opinions on, again, to ensure that we are able to frame the best possible scenario. But Mr. President, over and above that, this government is cognizant that this child protection legislation will not be effective if it exists on its own. If it does not exist within a frame in which there are other supporting policies and programs in order to ensure the total well-being of our children. And Mr. President, we are already, as a government, on course with that acknowledgement and understanding of the need to make sure that we have a full ecosystem of support for the children of Barbados that spans ministries, that spans across various sectors and players, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to identify the One Family program that again is being undertaken under the Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs, intending to lift 1,000 families out of poverty, Mr. President. 1,000 families out of poverty. Families with children and young people, Mr. President, lifting those families, bringing to bear the resources of the state in a coordinated way, not only to provide financial support, because that is what we'd have done before, but also as well to provide psychosocial support, mentoring support, opportunities for coaching and for work, Mr. President, in order, again, to ensure that we build out that full ecosystem. Mr. President, the National Peace Program just recently launched a community parenting initiative intended, again, to address the fundamental issues of whether or not our parents within this society have all of the skills and capacities they need in order to parent. Because there was a time that we took it for granted, Mr. President, that we took it for granted that parents knew how to parent, that we understood how to effectively raise our children. And I believe that we have come to the understanding that that is not always the case, and that parenting, like many other things, is a skill that we need to be able to build within our society, Mr. President. Mr. President, I grew up with a very strict father. My father was a former policeman, and he was a strict disciplinarian. My father was one of those persons, Mr. President, you could only look like if your face upset and you would get lashes. So you have to keep your face straight, because any kind of indication that you were upset or that you were not in agreement with something was a sign of rudeness, Mr. President. That is the type of father that I grew up with. And while I never got lashes by the dog hunter, the actual fact that there was one in my house was enough to drive fear in me. And Mr. President, I can be honest, I was a frightened child. So the fear alone kept me in good stead. The fear alone. But I remember an incident, Mr. President. We used to have these cane chairs in our house, and one of them caught a hole. So my father used to always say, don't sit in there because you're going to make it worse. So there was a time I was feeling myself a little bit. And I know that my father told me, don't sit down in there, but, you know, in skirt and blouse, I feel a little big. And so I sat in the chair, and lo and behold, the chair broke up. My father took up a piece of the broke up chair and lashed my tail with the same chair that I broke up. Now, Mr. President, that was not an everyday occurrence. But that was part of the discipline. That was part of the discipline in my household. Hard days you don't hear, oh, where you gonna feel, Mr. President. And I felt. I felt quite well, Mr. President. I could remember that incident from all of that time because, yes, shirt and blouse, you know, your skirt and blouse, you're feeling that you shouldn't be getting licks at that time, but no. And Mr. President, I've raised my daughter with a little bit more compassion. I'm sure that she's very happy. No cheer lashing, Mr. President, no cheer lashing. But I raised her with the same level of fear that she understood that her mother was a little bit of an idiot. And that should she get out of line, should I hear about her being disrespectful, Mr. President, that her mother would be the first on the scene to tar her little tail, Mr. President. Because it's the fear, Mr. President, and the understanding, Mr. President, that discipline will be exercised. And I bring that to bear within the discussion because there is sometimes a lack of understanding between discipline and a level of punishment that crosses over into abuse within our society. And as a society, because of our history, Mr. President, because of our history, we were a society of people that were brutalized, where violence was part of our everyday existence. So that it came to be embedded within our psyche, almost to be accepted. So that we turn a blind eye, Mr. President, to when the man licking up the woman, because that's a private matter in the household to be accepted, Mr. President. And sometimes we turn a blind eye to abuse in households with children, because again, we've come up within a society based on our history when we've come to accept a certain level of violence. And there are many within our society that would suggest the dog hunter lashes that I didn't get, that they got. The getting licked about with whatever was in somebody's hand, including a frying pan, a pot, somebody say. That all of those things were an acceptable level of violence, and that they grew up and nothing is wrong with them. But Mr. President, there's a different society, a different generation of young people. And if we know better, Mr. President, we ought now to do better. We ought now to understand that that notion of children should be seen and not heard cannot serve us well in all circumstances, Mr. President. We ought now to understand that according to the statistics, when we look at the different kinds of abuse existing within our society, that neglect is foremost, Mr. President. That neglect is foremost. And that is something that is unseen. And again, something before that was accepted. Because the mother got to leave the house to go and work, so she can leave the children alone to go fend for themselves. But that was in the day, Mr. President, when we had a society that was forged, again, by community and the notion of a village raising the child. That the next door neighbor will not prey on the child, but look out for the child. That the next door neighbor and the extended family can exercise a level of discipline. That level of society, Mr. President, in Barbados, unfortunately, Mr. President, doesn't exist. And if we understand that, if we understand that we live now in a society where there's a heightened level of predators, Mr. President, out there for our children, many of them living in the same households as our children, Mr. President. Some of them, unfortunately, Mr. President, in our schools, Mr. President, that we have to make sure again, if we know better, Mr. President, we do better. And this piece of legislation is the government's demonstration that we know better, that we understand that we live in a changing context, and that changing context must be met by strong legislation that provides adequately for the current context in which we live. Because, Mr. President, currently, child protection is embodied in outdated pieces of legislation, Mr. President. Outdated pieces of different types of legislation that we have to call on for protection. Mr. President, I want to make sure that I get it correctly, because they tell me that the Young Persons Protection Act is an act from 1918, Mr. President. An act from 1918, Mr. President. That the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act, which still governs the administration of the regime for the protection of children today, Mr. President, is an act from 1904. 1904. And we must ask ourselves, is this acceptable? Is it acceptable that in 2024, when we pride ourselves on being developed, when we pride ourselves as being a forward-looking country, when we pride ourselves on being a republic, that we will accept that the fate of our children is in the hands of outdated legislation that speaks to a context, Mr. President, that I don't know, that I don't understand, that has gone so far, Mr. President. And even if we have those two pieces, but the Child Care Board Act as well, CAP 381, is also from 1983. We also have the Supreme Court of Judicature, Mr. President, which governs the bill, but that's from 2008. The Protection of Children Act is a 1990 act, Mr. President. So that we exist within a frame that needed, Mr. President, to be updated, to be modernized, and to ensure that it addressed several deficiencies. And it is important that we have that context, because very often, sometimes people would question, why? If it ain't broke, why are we fixing it? We've been administering child protection all these years. Why? And Mr. President, I say first and foremost, why is that we owe it to our children to have a modern piece of legislation that addresses the contemporary. One of the other areas of debate, Mr. President, the public domain, is the extent to which this piece of legislation, the draft piece of legislation, was about Barbados adhering to an international convention and not necessarily framing a piece of legislation for Barbados. There were those that would suggest, or that suggested, that because that we are adhering to the UN Convention on Rights of the Child, that somehow we are doing an ill service to the country, to the nation's children, because of this frame that we are saying is an important part, an important standard, an important convention for us to be able to follow. First, Mr. President, that convention was signed on in 1990. in 1990, Mr. President. Not this administration. But even if this administration was in, Mr. President, we would have still signed it because it is part of the ethos of how we function as a government, as a Labour Party government, Mr. President. Because if we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, all of the tenets of the rights of those 54 statutes that make up that convention, Mr. President, speak to ensuring that we are creating an environment, Mr. President, that allows children to be able to function in an environment that is safe. Article 3, Mr. President, speaks to the best interests of the child. Article 12, Mr. President, speaks to respect for the views of the child. And you would see in this legislation, Mr. President, that we've made provision that in instances where the child is capable of having a point of view, that they have the right to be able to do so, to be able to speak to their own circumstances. That not only should adults make the decision for the child, but that we honor that voice and the agency of the child to be able to speak to their situation, to be able to speak to, have knowledge of, and be involved in the decisions around where they should be placed, Mr. President. So that we move from a situation, as we said before, of where children are seen and not heard, to this legislation making space for the voices of children, Mr. President, and allowing them to have a clear say when it comes to their own protection. Article 19, Mr. President, the rights of the child's right to protection from all forms of violence again. And you would see in the legislation that we have sought, Mr. President, to ensure that we have a comprehensive definition of abuse in all forms, Mr. President. And that definition, Mr. President, includes child labor, cyber abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, nonverbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse. So again, a contemporary piece of legislation that takes into consideration that there are elements of abuse and violence that are not always necessarily what we can see, but that we live in a society in which children, Mr. President, are groomed sexually on the internet, that we live in a society, Mr. President, in which you can deprive children of certain things, Mr. President. That is also abuse, Mr. President. When you put out the child to sleep outside, Mr. President, when you withhold the lunch money, Mr. President, and the child ain't got nothing to eat and have to go to sleep and go to school hungry, Mr. President, that is abuse as well. And Mr. President, we take these things for granted, most of us, because sometimes, very honestly, we turn a blind eye to it, and sometimes because we have been cocooned, Mr. President, in a certain way, that we don't necessarily understand the tragedy that we are facing within our societies. Again, the statistics suggest that annually we have approximately over 600 cases of abuse. That is reported. That is reported. Mr. President, I've heard stories recently, as recent as last year, where there was a situation in which a child, not even in her teens as yet, was placed in one of those rooms that people are now keeping. You know, you can rent, and you can rent a particular room. And she was placed in that room over a period of time where men could visit her and where the family would then bring food to her while she was there, Mr. President. Mr. President, I tried to be decent, again, but a child that was not yet even a teen, so not yet 13, was placed by her family in a room in which men were invited to have sex with her for money, and which then the family, knowing that they had put that child in there, used to bring food for her so that at least she could have food during the day. It meant then that the child was not going to school. It meant the child was being sexually exploited, Mr. President. Mr. President, I know of incidences where children, especially girls, are told that they have to make their way to help pay the bills and put on the street, Mr. President. These are the things that we faced. We heard in the other place, I hope that we heard in the other place, where the Honorable Minister of Education spoke about a case in which a child came to school with a full iron imprint on her back. A full iron imprint on her back that was crusted over, Mr. President. That was crusted over. No care. These are the things, Mr. President, that are happening within our society. And we take those things for granted, again, because we don't see them on a daily basis. And therefore, we don't understand why there is a need to ensure that we can provide the level of protection that is required, Mr. President, for the children. This legislation, Mr. President, provides for the protection that is important. Because, again, the suggestion was that the legislation seeks to usurp the family, seeks to usurp the role of parents, and that it will provide for every household that there is a child. Mr. President, at clause 3 under purpose, it says the purpose of this act shall be to protect a child from abuse and neglect. From abuse and neglect. So it speaks of those households and those instances when there is abuse and neglect. Provide for a child in need of care and protection. It seeks to promote the welfare of the child. And at D, Mr. President, ensure compliance with that UN Convention and the rights of the child that I spoke about. And that I went through to show as well aligns with all of the best practices and standards relating to ensure that we can safeguard our children. But, Mr. President, the Act seeks to, yes, act in the best interest of the child. And in so doing, in the best interest of the child, it provides checks and balances to ensure that the best interest of the child is being taken care of by everyone that is involved within the system and within the process, Mr. President. No one is coming to anybody's house and picking up the child, Mr. President, just because. It identifies that the safety and the welfare, I'm reading, Mr. President, from clause 4, the safety and the welfare of the child shall be given paramount consideration in all actions and decisions in relation to the child. Where a child is able to form his own view on a matter concerning his safety or welfare, he shall be afforded an opportunity to freely express his views, and his views are to be given weight. Mr. President, at D, it says, the least intrusive intervention in the life of a child and his family shall be taken in order to protect the child from harm and promote the development of the child. That's the legislation. The least intrusive intervention in the life of the child and his family. That's the legislation. Mr. President, if I go back to 3.2, when we talk about the best interest, it says, in determining what is the best interest of the child, the following matters shall be taken into account. The safety of the child, the capacity of the parent to properly discharge, the physical, mental, emotional, or psychological needs, the appropriate care and treatment, where appropriate, the views of the child, and again, repeated, the views of the child, the positive development of the child as a member of the family, Mr. President. The love, affection, and ties between the child and other persons in the life of the family. The continuity of the care for the child and the possible effect of the disruption of that care on the child. This is a legislation, Mr. President. This is a legislation. So contrary to those that would want us to believe that we are making way for people to come in like the Gestapo and come into your house and take up your child, Mr. President, the legislation says that they are bound to consider all of these tenants as they go about making a decision about the care and welfare of that child, Mr. President. An important emphasis I've read, and those are not the only instances, where the legislation speaks to the paramountcy of the family, Mr. President. I talked about the fact that the National Peace Program has just launched a program to do parenting at the community level. How could a government, Mr. President, be seen to be want to take children from their parents, destroy homes, and at the same time is seeking to build capacity of parents to be able to function? Mr. President, explain to me. Sure working, Mr. President. How could a government be accused, Mr. President, of wanting to do harm, Mr. President, to children when we are giving them voice, Mr. President? At every stage throughout the process, we are giving voice to the views of children so that they can have a say, so that it's not, again, just only the agency and even the court, because the legislation provides that even within the corners of the court, that the child can be allowed to have a say in the matter, Mr. President. The legislation provides for mandatory reporting. And Mr. President, that was also a cause for concern. Again, those that want to distract and disrupt and to create confusion would suggest that the government is coming in like a big honcho and saying now that it's making everybody and applying fines for everybody and making everybody have to pay if they don't report. The legislation, Mr. President, is very clear. I think it is at section 24, Mr. President, of the legislation. I'm correct, Mr. President, at section 24, mandatory reporting. It identifies that this applies to a parent, a medical practitioner, an administrator of a hospital or medical facility, a school's principal, a social worker, law enforcement officer, internet provider, people who provide health care. It delineates what are called the duty bearers, Mr. President, who have a responsibility to report when they come into contact. And Mr. President, I can tell you the truth. I want to hold up my hand. I would not have been vexed, Mr. President, if it was to everybody. Because all of us should have a responsibility to look after the children within our society. Yeah. All of us, Mr. President, should want to report abuse. All of us, Mr. President, should want to ensure that the children in this society are protected. So to be honest, I could not understand what was the noise around. Because the idea of reporting, the idea of saying to the appropriate authorities that harm is being done to our children, why would that be an affront to any of us? Why would that be an affront? And I want to encourage all Barbadians. You're not here in the legislation. You are not found in this legislation under mandatory reporting. I want to say it again. But I want to encourage all Barbadians. This society and the children are ours, Mr. President. My daughter is fairly mature, but Mr. President, if I pass in the street and I see a child too late as we running down my window and looking out, Mr. President, I just be checking if I see a child with certain patterns in my community, Mr. President, trying to understand what is going on, Mr. President. I just be checking, Mr. President, if I see that the child looking raggedy. I was talking to a lady that operates within the bus terminal at Oystons. And she was saying to me that even as a vendor on a daily basis, she has to look out for children, again, to provide money for bus fare, to help them with their school supplies, to help them when they are bullied. Mr. President, all of us have a moral and ethical responsibility to provide that care, to look out for, Mr. President, our children. And so where this legislation speaks to mandatory reporting, I believe then that we can even go beyond that. But again, this legislation identifies those specific duty bearers, Mr. President. Importantly, one of the things that this legislation also does is update the penalties, Mr. President, that can be found when people contravene the provisions in respect to the protection. Mr. President, under the Prevention of Cruelty legislation, Mr. President, I believe I am told the maximum fine there was $24. $24, Mr. President. A maximum fine of $24, Mr. President. $24, Mr. President. And so the legislation seeks then, even in the consideration of mandatory reporting, to make sure that there is compliance, establishes both an administrative penalty as well as a penalty for those who intentionally make a false report or provide false or misleading information. They're guilty, Mr. President, of a fine of $10,000 or imprisonment for 1 year or both, Mr. President. One of the other areas that this legislation seeks to address was the fact that it did not provide for the accurate delineation of the responsibilities of the Child Care Board specifically. And we would see that within the legislation, we have the establishment of a Child Protection Agency, and that the legislation now outlines very carefully, Mr. President, the responsibilities, the powers and duties of that authority, so that it gives the Child Care Board now, or in this case, once this legislation is passed, the Child Protection Authority, a clear sphere, a clear ambit by which it should operate in relation to the protection of our children, Mr. President. It provides for the establishment of a board as well, and therefore provides again for an authoritative framework where those that have been charged with the responsibility for that care now, within the context of law, have a firm footing, Mr. President. Because under the old frame, first of all, you used to have to, when you go to court, refer to all of those previous pieces of legislation. There were very limited areas for intervention, Mr. President. In one case, in where a matter could be brought only when the parent committed an act that was seen as criminal, and then when the parent agreed, Mr. President. But we know there will be instances when the parent's not going to agree. There will be instances when the matter is not necessarily criminal, but it is still abuse. And so that this legislation is seeking to ensure that it corrects those deficiencies, Mr. President, within the frame. And not only that it is seeking as well, Mr. President, to correct those deficiencies, but it now as well is seeking to outline a clear frame for how intervention should take place, the steps that the authorities need to be able to take, and the options that will be available, Mr. President. If you look at, again, Clause 22, it identifies the steps that need to be able to be taken in interventions, the reports, Mr. President, that need to be given, the investigation and assessment as well, at Clause 28, that needs to be able to be undertaken as well. Spells those out in detail, Mr. President. So that when you looking at the intervention, the area of intervention, again, the authorities are tasked to make sure that they provide or that they look to a number of issues in respect of the household, and particularly, Mr. President, at 22.3, the removal of a child from the parent shall only occur where it is necessary to protect the child from the risk of serious harm or danger, Mr. President. When you look at, again, the issue of intervention and the range of intervention there, Mr. President, it talks about enable the child and his parent to have access to appropriate services, Mr. President. So we're talking now not just about a punitive system. We're now talking about a system that provides for a range of interventions that can be transformative in the life of not only the child, but as well the parent, Mr. President. That we can then point that family into ways in which they can better cope. Because, Mr. President, quite honestly, quite frankly, there are some instances, and I talked about it before, when parents just don't know better. When you have grown up in a family of violence, Mr. President, violence would beget violence, Mr. President. And you can have continuations of cycles, but unless specific intervention is made, those cycles will not be broken. So that the list of the makeup now of this bill understands intrinsically, again, the type of society that we have and how it was formed. And the fact that, again, abuse, while we need to be able to protect the children, we also as well need to ensure that we secure the family, Mr. President, and the family unit from which that child will operate. Because it is not about removal of that child in a punitive way, Mr. President, but ensuring, again, that we can provide the full ecosystem. One of the innovations, Mr. President, as well, that we would find is that the Act removes, again, and I want to use the word, the punishment for wandering. And that is important. I think, Mr. President, that many of us, again, see children. We can sometimes, I would want to say, sometimes cast judgment and accuse children of certain things and certain acts without necessarily knowing the circumstance that they are in. So again, as I talked about before, we see children on the streets, all manner of day and night. And we would often say as Bajans, that girl what this? Mr. President, excuse my Bajanism. Or, she ain't gotten brought up see. And we cast judgment on children. We cast judgment on their actions and their behavior. We cast judgments on sometimes even, Mr. President, when they are aggressive and they get involved in certain activities without fully understanding that they may actually be running from something within their households. That when we penalize and criminalize children for wandering, we are not necessarily addressing the core issue. And so that the contemplation is that we would now have a frame at which those children will be protected and not punished, Mr. President. Protected and not punished. And the ministry, that's the Ministry of People's Empowerment, has already been allocated within the estimates within this financial year a sum of $3 million to already begin to build out that facility that can ensure, again, that we are able to treat to our children in a way that is not punitive, but is transformative. And that transformative element, Mr. President, is extremely important. Just, I think 2 days ago, time is moving so quickly, May 25th was actually Africa Day, Mr. President. On Africa Day, the Division of Culture, we hosted over 200 children from about 6 primary schools, along with schools from Africa. We had the Gambia, we had Liberia, we had Nigeria as well. Previously, we would have had as well Ghana, South Africa as well, there, Kenya as well participating. And that exercise, Mr. President, was about ensuring that our children understand who they are and where they come from, Mr. President. That they have an intrinsic understanding of their own history, Mr. President. That we can raise children within a society that are confident, that can hold their heads up, Mr. President. And that is part of the creation of that full ecosystem that this legislation will be a part of. That will also as well lead to the transformative elements. It is why, Mr. President, we are also as well looking for the establishment of a dedicated family court, Mr. President, that will provide not only for dedicated resources, but also as well counselors, Mr. President, within that dedicated system. It is why, Mr. President, we have created a nexus with the Child Justice Bill as well. Because we understand that protection and justice must go hand in hand, Mr. President. This is why, Mr. President, we have a youth development program, Mr. President. This is why we have the intervention of the National Peace Program again. Because we understand that we must build an entire frame that will support this legislation in its effort to ensure the protection of our children. Mr. President, as I close, I again want to commend the Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs for bringing this piece of legislation. I want to again commend all of the stakeholders that would have been integral in bringing to the fore their critical concerns. And Mr. President, if again you look at the record of the proceedings, you would note that there were several instances in which the comments and recommendations of those stakeholders who met with the committee were actually taken on board, and that there are now amendments based on those interventions. Those interventions help us, all of us, to be able to clarify the purpose and scope of the legislation, Mr. President. I want to suggest that our children are the better for this piece of legislation, that the society is better for the work that has been done on this piece of legislation and as well on the child justice legislation. I want to suggest, Mr. President, that this process, marked as it was by the best standards for participatory democracy, Mr. President, augurs well for how we will ensure that all of those that need to be involved in ensuring this legislation is fully implemented will be able to do so. And as I said, Mr. President, I want to commend this legislation to the House. I want to commend, Mr. President, that we fully support this legislation and the intent, Mr. President, to provide for the protection of the children of Barbados for now and in the future. I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chantal Malroy-Knight. Senator Watson.
Mr. President, good morning. Thank you for acknowledging me. Good morning to all of you, all the members. Sorry, I must be living very happy to want to reverse, or maybe I just want to reverse time. Anyway, thanks for that correction. You should have risen on a point of order. Good morning. Sorry, here I go again. Good afternoon to everyone. I want to welcome all of the Barbadians who are here in the gallery joining us today. And I do think this is important. Actually, it occurs to me that many Barbadians do not realize that they can join us in the Senate for debates, and that's something that I think that we should make known. I want to start by thanking the members of the Joint Select Committee on Social Sector and the Environment for the work on the two bills. We're, of course, only considering one of them today, but I think it's important to recognize that work. And I want to thank all of the citizens and organizations that engaged in that process. That engagement in the consultative process is also extremely important. Very importantly, though, I want to give my compliments to the public servants that formulated the policy that we see embedded in the legislation that we're looking at, who do the hard graft. And in all of this, we must thank also the parliamentary staff who support the Joint Select Committee. This is an 800-page report that was produced. It was daunting to review it, and it must have been daunting to prepare it. And I want to compliment the committee and the parliamentary staff for the work that they did there. As a person who spends a lot of time drafting documents, I know that that's not easy, and my compliments, most certainly. Of course, we're only looking at the one bill today, the Child Protection Bill. It may seem unusual, Mr. President, but I'm going to give government credit. Credit is due. Perhaps you should raise a point of order. However, I'm going to give credit where it's due. The bill is a departure from the current regime, and Senator Monroe Knight went through examples of those changes that we're looking at. This current regime for managing children is archaic, and an overhaul is long overdue. We must evolve as the world evolves. I think anyone raising children today know that they're different, but also our social circumstances and our culture is somewhat different. The evolution is necessary, and I'm glad that it is occurring. The bill is intended to, it states that, follow the principles embedded in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Human Rights Convention. And of course, we know that these two conventions embody the principles that relate to ensuring that human beings, adults and children, are granted certain rights, which are intended to ensure that they can enjoy their lives. That's really the long short of it. That's the simple way of putting it. And what I want to say in relation to the bill is that the government's responsibilities towards children are not limited to what is covered in the bill. And I want to focus on other responsibilities of the government that must align with the principles that are set out in this bill as governing principles. And I think we need to be reminded that the government's responsibility isn't just limited to sexual and other physical abuses and to mental abuses, but also to ensuring the protection of children, the children's well-being, while they are in the government's care. Now, it causes me to reflect, Mr. President, on recent incidents that caused consternation among parents in Barbados and others. And in the discussion of the bills, there was reference to alarmist statements, alarmist conduct, but I think it is unfair to cast criticisms purely in that light. And that's something that we are finding a lot when the government considers criticisms that are being offered by citizens about policies or actions of the government. And I think the government has to be very careful lest it find itself ignoring important criticisms, important reflections of the people who are affected by government policies and have to abide by legislation that's being passed by the government. Mr. President, I'm first going to reflect on an incident that, as it was occurring, I was notified. I was notified because I am a parent of that school, or I was no longer at the time. And that is what I refer to as the Springer Terror. I call it that because that is how the children felt. And I belong to a parent WhatsApp chat. And I believe I still belong to that chat, even though my child is long gone from the school. But people enter that chat to query what was happening, to express concern, and you could detect the pain. And I am close to the school because I know children who are still there, parents, obviously, who are still there, and teachers who are still there. Some of them are friends. That horror, Mr. President, was not just a simulation. It was not just over-exuberant planners and actors. It wasn't just girls overreacting because they were not in a classroom or having a panicked response. Mr. President, I think we would all here agree that if someone masked, chased you with what looked like a cutlass, you would have a panicked response. And so I was perturbed by the characterization of the response of mere children on that day. They're children. They're children who we tell they cannot make decisions for themselves, but we expected them to behave like hardened adults when that terror was visited on them. And that attack was perpetrated on 1,000 children and teachers in a school managed and operated by the Barbados government. Mr. President, to this day, the same government has refused to take direct responsibility. None of the usual loquacious ministers and representatives, including our Prime Minister, has apologized to those children, except for the head of the Ministry. Parents and teachers have not gotten an apology either. No one has been held accountable for that act, or I should say those, because there were many that were perpetrated on children in Barbados on that day. And then it got worse because they were blamed for their reaction to terror that was visited on them. Now, we also have not heard about any police investigation, no arrest, no charges, no identification of the men that marauded through that school on that day, no dismissals, no discipline that we are aware of. For me, this runs counter to the principles that are embedded in this child protection law. And the government has to take responsibility. It has to recognize responsibility because the government appoints the boards, it employs the teachers, the principals, is responsible for the policies, it allocates the children to the schools. It is responsible in those 6 hours that children are at school for the care and control of children in Barbados. So yes, what happened on that day is the government's fault. And it falls afoul of the principles that are embedded in this bill that we are reviewing today. That's indisputable, Mr. President. It's not to be forgotten. It's not to be forgotten because it cannot be permitted to happen again. Certainly the parents, children, affected teachers, and their families and friends will not forget. It's still talked about. I can tell you that because I am close to some of the people who were in that place on that day. And they are still recovering psychologically from what was visited on them. And Mr. President, ironically, if we applied the provisions of the Child Protection Bill that we're considering right here, right now, the responsible school personnel, ministry personnel, the actual marauders, and some of the others who attended the scene, police, firemen, would be in breach of the clause in the bill relating to cruelty to children. That's section 64, and I think it's important that we understand what the requirement is there. That clause requires that a parent or person over the age of 18 years old who has custody, charge, or care of a child, and who abuses or exposes the child to abuse, exposes the child to danger, fails to protect the child from abuse, neglects the child, mistreats the child, or causes a child to be in need of protection, is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine